March 1983, North Atlantic. Commander Victor Antonovich Petrov pressed his forehead against the cold periscope housing, feeling the subtle vibration of the Typhoon's nuclear reactor through the steel. 800 feet of black water separated his submarine from the storm-tossed surface above. Icebergs drifted like silent sentinels through the freezing depths. Nothing up there could touch them. Nothing could even know they existed. He was wrong. 5 miles above, Senior Airman Thomas Hendrickx jerked awake as his console chirped. The RC-135 Rivet Joint had been circling over the Norwegian Sea for 6 hours, a modified Boeing 777 stuffed with electronic surveillance equipment that could intercept Soviet secrets from international airspace. Hendrickx had been monitoring the electromagnetic spectrum, eyes burning, mind numb from the monotony. Then the impossible happened. 3 seconds. That's all it took. A burst transmission cut through the static, originating from somewhere deep beneath the waves. Hendrickx's training took over instantly. His fingers flew across the console, capturing every microsecond of the signal. Frequency, modulation, direction, finding. The pattern matched nothing in the database, except for one terrifying possibility. His voice barely rose above the drone of the aircraft's engines. "I think I just found a Typhoon." The mission commander appeared at his shoulder. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison had been flying reconnaissance missions since Vietnam. Hendrickx watched his face drain of color as he studied the readout. "You're certain?" "90%, sir. Transmission characteristics match RSM-52 communication protocol." "If I'm right, that's only the 3rd confirmed Typhoon detection outside Soviet territorial waters." Morrison's hand reached for the secure radio. "Get me Keflavik." "Priority Alpha." Below, Petrov had no idea his 3-second status report to Murmansk had just lit up every NATO screen from Iceland to Norfolk. The largest submarine ever built, 575 feet long, 48,000 tons submerged, carrying 20 nuclear missiles capable of destroying 200 American cities, had just become visible. Before we dive deeper into this story of Cold War espionage, hit subscribe. These deep dive investigations take weeks to research, and your support makes them possible. Now, let's rewind to understand how American aircraft learned to see the invisible to track submarines from the sky. The story begins not in 1983, but in 1945. When World War II ended and 2 superpowers faced each other across an ideological divide, the development of nuclear weapons had fundamentally altered warfare. Both the United States and Soviet Union recognized that submarines carrying nuclear missiles represented the ultimate assurance policy. Submarine could hide beneath the waves, invisible and untouchable, ready to launch devastating retaliation, even if the homeland had been reduced to radioactive ash. This concept, known as second strike capability, became the cornerstone of nuclear deterrence. The Soviet Union poured enormous resources into its submarine fleet. Joseph Stalin understood the importance of naval power, and his successors, Khrushchev. Brezhnev continued this emphasis throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Soviet shipyards worked around the clock, producing submarines of increasing sophistication. Early vessels were noisy and unreliable, prone to mechanical failures and easily detected by American listening posts. But the Soviets learned quickly. Each new class incorporated improvements in quieting technology, better reactor designs, more sophisticated communications equipment. By the 1970s, the gap between Soviet and American submarine technology had narrowed considerably. American intelligence analysts studied satellite photographs of Soviet shipyards, counting the hulls under construction and estimating capabilities. But photographs revealed only so much. To truly understand what the Soviets were building, the Americans needed to listen. They needed to intercept submarine communications, track movements, learn operational patterns. This requirement gave birth to one of the most remarkable reconnaissance programs in military history. The RC-135 aircraft evolved from the KC-135 Stratotanker, itself a military variant of the Boeing 777 commercial airliner. The first reconnaissance versions appeared in the early 1960s. It's modified to carry electronic surveillance equipment that could intercept enemy communications and radar signals. These early aircraft were crewed by later standards equipment, bulky, capabilities limited, but they represented a revolutionary concept. The ability to conduct signals intelligence from the relative safety of international airspace, gathering information that would otherwise require dangerous ground operations deep within enemy territory. Initial RC-135 variants focused on intercepting communications from land-based military installations and tracking Soviet bomber movements. But as the submarine threat grew, the mission expanded. Engineers at the Electronic Security Command, working in classified facilities across the United States, developed new sensors and processing systems specifically designed to detect and analyze electronic emissions from submarines. This was an extraordinarily challenging technical problem. Submarines, by their nature, minimize electromagnetic signatures. They operate submerged for extended periods, communicating only when absolutely necessary. When they do transmit, they use sophisticated encryption and burst transmission techniques designed to minimize detection chances. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. American scientists had long known that submarines, despite their best efforts at radio silence, could not completely eliminate their electronic presence. Nuclear reactors, even carefully shielded ones, produced distinctive electromagnetic signatures. Navigation systems designed for minimal emission still radiated detectable signals. Most importantly, submarines had to communicate, eventually receiving orders from command authorities, reporting positions and status, coordinating with other naval forces. These communications, however brief and encrypted, represented vulnerabilities that could be exploited. The RC-135 Rivet Joint, which entered service in 1973, represented the culmination of these technological developments. The aircraft carried over 30 specialists, each trained in specific aspects of signals intelligence. Some monitored radar emissions, tracking the sweeps of Soviet search radars and the lock-on signatures of fire control systems. Others focused on communications intercepts, tuning into everything from high-frequency naval broadcasts to encrypted command channels. Still others operated sophisticated processing systems that analyzed and correlated collected data in real time, searching for patterns that might reveal operational intentions. The aircraft's antennae formed visible as distinctive cheek fairings, and tail modifications distinguishing it from civilian. 7.7s could detect electromagnetic emissions across a vast spectrum of frequencies, from very low-frequency submarine communications to microwave radar signals. Blade antennas jutted from the fuselage, direction-finding arrays studied the tail section, and sensitive receivers occupied every available space in the converted cargo bay. Most importantly, the Rivet Joint carried equipment specifically designed to detect the characteristic emissions of submarine communication systems, burst transmissions that lasted only seconds but left distinctive signatures in the electromagnetic spectrum. Commander Petrov had no idea that his submarine's routine communication with naval headquarters in Murmansk had been intercepted. The transmission lasted less than 3 seconds, a compressed burst of encrypted data containing nothing more than a routine status report. Soviet naval communications doctrine emphasized brevity and encryption. Petrov had followed protocols precisely. He would have been horrified to learn those 3 seconds had been enough for Hendrickx and his colleagues, not only to detect the transmission, but to triangulate its approximate origin point. The RC-135's ability to locate submarines through communications relied on sophisticated techniques. When a submarine transmitted even briefly, the aircraft's multiple antennas measured the direction from which the signal originated. By combining this directional information with data from other sensors, including the aircraft's, precise navigation systems, and information shared from ground-based listening posts, analysts could estimate the submarine's location with surprising accuracy. This technique, known as signals intelligence geolocation, had been perfected through years of practice and technological refinement. But detecting a transmission was only the first step. The real challenge lay in analyzing intercepted signals to extract useful intelligence. Soviet military communications were protected by some of the most sophisticated encryption systems in the world. KGB cryptographic experts had learned painful lessons from code compromises during World War II, developing entirely new approaches to secure communications. Breaking these codes was the responsibility of the National Security Agency, working from its massive headquarters at Fort Meade, Maryland. The hunters in the sky and the codebreakers on the ground formed a seamless intelligence web. The intelligence value of tracking Soviet submarines cannot be overstated. Understanding where submarines were allowed American naval commanders to deploy their own forces more effectively. They could position attack submarines to shadow Soviet boomers, ready to sink them in the event of war. They could route aircraft carriers and surface vessels away from areas where enemy submarines lurked. They could refine their understanding of Soviet naval doctrine, learning how the enemy intended to fight and developing countermeasures accordingly. The information also supported arms control negotiations, providing verification data that helped both sides have confidence in treaty compliance. The cat-and-mouse game between American reconnaissance aircraft and Soviet submarines played out across the vast expanses of the world's oceans. The North Atlantic was a particularly active theater. Soviet submarines based in Murmansk had to transit the gap between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom to reach patrol areas in the open ocean. American and NATO forces established an elaborate sensor network across this gap: underwater listening arrays, surface ships, submarines, and aircraft. The RC-135s were a crucial element. Their ability to detect and track electronic emissions complemented the acoustic sensors that listened for distinctive sounds of submarine propulsion. The Soviets were not passive participants. They understood their submarines were being hunted and developed increasingly sophisticated countermeasures. New classes of submarines incorporated advanced quieting technology, making them harder to detect acoustically. Communications procedures were revised to minimize transmission times and frequencies. Electronic warfare specialists developed systems designed to detect and jam enemy surveillance equipment. The KGB launched aggressive counterintelligence operations aimed at penetrating American signals intelligence programs and learning their capabilities. One of the most dramatic confrontations occurred in October 1981, when a Soviet Whiskey-class submarine ran aground in Swedish territorial waters near the Karlskrona naval base. The incident, known as Whiskey on the Rocks in the Western press, deeply embarrassed the Soviet Navy, but it also revealed the extent of Soviet intelligence-gathering operations in areas NATO considered safe. The submarine had been conducting a reconnaissance mission, mapping approaches to Swedish naval facilities and gathering electronic intelligence on Swedish military communications. The grounding was accidental, the result of a navigation error, but demonstrated that the Soviets were willing to take significant risks in their efforts to understand and counter Western surveillance capabilities. The RC-135 community responded to Soviet countermeasures with continuous technological upgrades. New antenna systems improved the aircraft's ability to detect weak signals. Advanced processing computers allowed faster and more accurate analysis of intercepted transmissions. The development of satellite-based relay systems meant intelligence could be transmitted from aircraft to analysts on the ground in real time, dramatically reducing the time between collection and exploitation. By the mid-1980s, the RC-135 fleet represented the most sophisticated airborne signals intelligence capability in the world. Hendrickx carefully logged the contact he had detected. Following meticulous procedures governing every aspect of RC-135 operations, the signal characteristics suggested a Soviet submarine, probably a ballistic missile boat, based on frequency and modulation patterns. He passed the information to Morrison, who immediately recognized the significance. The Typhoon-class represented the pinnacle of Soviet submarine technology. At 175 meters in length and displacing over 48,000 tons submerged, these submarines were nearly twice the size of their American counterparts. They carried 20 RSM-52 ballistic missiles, each armed with 10 independently targetable nuclear warheads. A single Typhoon launching its full complement could destroy 200 separate targets across the continental United States. The submarines were designed to operate beneath the Arctic ice cap, surfacing through the ice to launch their missiles if deterrence failed. Their size allowed them to carry enormous quantities of supplies, enabling patrols lasting several months without returning to port. Morrison ordered the aircraft to adjust its orbit, maximizing chances of intercepting any further transmissions from the submarine. He also initiated secure communication with the Naval Security Group activity at Keflavik, Iceland, requesting additional resources be devoted to tracking the contact. Within hours, a P-3 Orion maritime patrol aircraft would be diverted from its regular patrol to investigate the area, carrying sonobuoys that could potentially localize the submarine acoustically. The coordination between different intelligence collection platforms was one of the great strengths of the American surveillance system. RC-135s could detect electronic emissions from vast distances, providing initial cueing that allowed other platforms to focus efforts more effectively. P-3 Orions could then localize targets using acoustic sensors, dropping patterns of sonobuoys that could triangulate the submarine's position with considerable precision. Attack submarines could shadow located targets, maintaining contact for extended periods. Satellites could provide additional information about surface conditions, weather, and movements of Soviet naval forces operating in support of the submarine. Petrov had no knowledge of the activity his brief transmission had triggered. His submarine continued its patrol, descending to the cold, dark depths where water pressure compressed the hull, and the only sounds were the steady hum of the reactor and occasional pings of expanding ice on the surface far above. He conducted drills with his crew, ensuring they remained sharp and ready for the unthinkable order that might one day come through the extremely low-frequency receiver. He reviewed his patrol orders, memorizing coordinates of launch positions assigned to him, and target packages his missiles were programmed to strike. The psychological burden of commanding a nuclear missile submarine was immense. Petrov kept a sealed envelope in his safe marked Authorized Strike Package. Do not open unless inside were coordinates Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, his own cities. Soviet fail-safe protocols demanded commanders target their homeland if captured, ensuring no intelligence value could be extracted from their weapons. He had locked it away the day he assumed command, praying he would never feel its weight again. Now, weeks into patrol, that envelope haunted his dreams. He would wake in his narrow bunk, heart-pounding, convinced he had heard the launch order, and reality would reassert itself. Just another drill, just another day of waiting for a war that must never come. The isolation of submarine service compounded this burden. Weeks passed without communication from the outside world. Even when messages arrived, they were typically brief and operational. Petrov had no idea what was happening in Moscow, whether tensions with the Americans were rising or falling, whether his wife Katerina was healthy or ill, whether his daughter Natasha had passed her university entrance exams. He existed in a bubble of uncertainty, sustained only by discipline and duty. The crew of the Typhoon numbered over 160 officers and men, organized into two complete teams that rotated duty shifts to allow the submarine to remain at sea indefinitely. These men had been carefully selected for psychological stability and ideological reliability. The Soviet Navy understood that crews of ballistic missile submarines bore an awesome responsibility. Political officers monitored morale and reported any signs of wavering commitment. Periodic psychological evaluations screened for stress reactions that might compromise reliability. The command structure ensured no single individual could launch missiles without proper authorization. Life aboard a Typhoon was relatively comfortable by submarine standards. The enormous size allowed for amenities unthinkable on smaller boats: a swimming pool, a sauna, even a small arboretum where plants grew under artificial light, providing a psychological connection to the surface world. The crew had access to a small library, a gymnasium, recreation spaces where they could watch approved films or play chess during off-duty hours. These facilities were not luxuries but necessities designed to maintain crew morale during months-long patrols, when the submarine might not surface once between leaving Murmansk and returning. The daily routine was carefully structured to maintain both discipline and mental health. Wake-up calls echoed through the compartments at 0600 hours. Breakfast was served in shifts, the galley producing meals that, while not matching home cooking, were far superior to the canned rations of earlier submarine generations. Exercise periods were mandatory. Men ran on treadmills, lifted weights, swam laps in the small pool. The physical activity helped combat the lethargy that could set in during long patrols in the unchanging environment of the deep ocean. Even so, the psychological strain took its toll. Men who had served multiple patrols often showed signs of stress, difficulty sleeping, irritability, withdrawal. Their relationships with family members were strained by long separations and the secrecy surrounding their work. Petrov had seen strong men break under the pressure, requiring evacuation and psychological treatment. The Navy screened carefully for such vulnerabilities, but no selection process was perfect. The burden of carrying civilization's end in your missile tubes was one that no amount of training could fully prepare you for. Aboard the RC-135, the crew settled into the patient routine of electronic surveillance. The aircraft maintained its orbit, sensors scanning the electromagnetic spectrum for any sign of the submarine they had briefly detected. Hours passed without further contact, but this was expected. Soviet submarine commanders were trained to minimize electronic emissions. The Typhoon's patrol orders probably specified extended periods of complete radio silence. The Americans would have to wait, hoping the submarine would need to communicate again before leaving the area. Morrison used the quiet time to review intelligence reports about Soviet submarine operations in the North Atlantic. The reports, transmitted from NSA headquarters via encrypted satellite link, painted a complex picture of the undersea struggle. Soviet submarines were becoming more capable with each passing year, their acoustic signatures diminishing as new quieting technologies were incorporated. The gap between American and Soviet submarine technology, once vast, had narrowed to the point where detection was becoming increasingly difficult. The intelligence community was responding with new sensors and analytical techniques, but the advantage was shifting toward the submarines. This trend deeply concerned American naval strategists. The ability to track Soviet ballistic missile submarines was considered essential to maintaining strategic stability. Submarines could not be found, they could not be targeted, which meant they represented an invulnerable second strike capability. In theory, this should have reinforced deterrence. The Soviets would always be confident of their ability to retaliate. In practice, uncertainty created dangerous incentives. American war planners, uncertain of enemy submarine locations, might be tempted to strike first in a crisis, hoping to catch as many boats as possible in port before they could deploy. Soviet planners, aware of this temptation, might adopt hair-trigger alert postures that increase the risk of accidental war. Intelligence gathered by RC-135 aircraft and other surveillance platforms helped reduce this uncertainty. By tracking Soviet submarine deployments, American analysts maintained awareness of the submarine threat and developed more measured responses to crises. The reconnaissance missions were not merely military operations, but contributions to the stability of the entire international system. The technological competition between superpowers extended beyond platforms to the people who operated them. Both sides invested heavily in training, recognizing that sophisticated equipment was useless without skilled personnel. American signals intelligence specialists underwent months of intensive instruction before being assigned to operational units. They studied Soviet military organization, communications procedures, equipment characteristics. They learned to recognize distinctive signatures of different transmission types, developing intuitive understanding that allowed them to quickly assess intercepted signal significance. Soviet submarine crews received equally rigorous training. Officers who commanded ballistic missile submarines were among the most carefully selected and intensively educated personnel in the Soviet military. They attended specialized academies where they studied not only submarine operations, but nuclear physics, international relations, the political ideology justifying their mission. Crews underwent extensive psychological screening and continuous political education. The Soviet Navy understood these men held the fate of nations in their hands. They left nothing to chance in ensuring reliability. Hours continued to pass aboard the RC-135. The crew changed shifts, fresh operators taking over consoles while exhausted colleagues tried to find comfortable positions in the cramped crew rest area. The aircraft refueled from a KC-135 tanker that rendezvoused with them over the Norwegian CIA delicate operation, requiring precise flying and close coordination. Morrison reviewed fuel calculations, determining how much longer they could remain on station before weather conditions or fuel constraints forced them to return to their base at RAF Mildenhall in England. As dawn approached, the decision was made to end the mission. The submarine had not transmitted again. There was no way to know whether it remained in the area or had moved to a different patrol zone. Intelligence from the single detected transmission would be analyzed in detail, contributing to the ever-growing database of Soviet submarine operations. But for now, there was nothing more the RC-135 could accomplish. The aircraft turned eastward, beginning the long flight back to England. The story of that particular mission might seem anticlimactic. Brief detection followed by hours of fruitless waiting. But this was the nature of signals intelligence. Patient, methodical collection that gradually accumulated into a comprehensive picture of enemy capabilities and intentions. Each mission, even those producing little apparent result, contributed to overall understanding of the Soviet threat. Occasionally, patient work paid off with dramatic discoveries that transformed the strategic landscape. One such discovery occurred in 1982 when RC-135 aircraft operating over the Sea of Okhotsk detected an unusual pattern of Soviet naval communications. Analysis of intercepted signals revealed that the Soviet Pacific Fleet was conducting a major exercise involving multiple ballistic missile submarines. The exercise appeared to be testing new operational procedures, allowing submarines to launch missiles more quickly after receiving orders from Moscow. This intelligence was vital to American war planners, who needed to understand how quickly Soviet nuclear forces could respond in a crisis. The discovery prompted a flurry of activity across the American intelligence community. Additional RC-135 missions were scheduled to gather more data. Satellites were repositioned to photograph participating vessels. Submarine commanders were briefed on the new intelligence and instructed to report any observations that might shed light on Soviet procedures. The analysis that followed took months as experts pieced together fragments of information into a coherent picture of Soviet nuclear command and control. The relationship between intelligence collection and diplomacy was complex and sometimes contradictory. The ability to monitor Soviet military activities provided confidence that agreements could be verified, facilitating negotiations. However, reconnaissance missions themselves were a constant source of tension as the Soviets resented the intrusion and occasionally responded with aggressive intercepts that endangered American aircraft. Several RC-135s were damaged in encounters with Soviet fighters. One, an RC-135S Cobra Ball, was nearly shot down in 1983 during a particularly tense period of Soviet-American relations. The incident occurred on September 1, 1983. The same night, a Soviet interceptor shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, killing all 269 people aboard. RC-135s had been operating in the same general area, tracking a Soviet missile test. There was considerable confusion in Moscow about the nature of aircraft that had penetrated Soviet airspace. Some Soviet officials initially believed the passenger airliner was actually a spy plane, or that the two aircraft were operating in coordination. This confusion contributed to the decision to shoot down Cal 007, one of the deadliest incidents of the Cold War. The tragedy led to increased scrutiny of American reconnaissance operations in the Pacific. Critics questioned whether the proximity of RC-135 missions to Soviet airspace had contributed to confusion that led to the shootdown. The Air Force vigorously defended its operations, noting the RC-135 had been operating in international airspace at all times and had not violated Soviet territory. But the incident highlighted the risks inherent in intelligence gathering, the reality that reconnaissance aircraft crews operated in dangerous proximity to hostile forces that might mistake their intentions. The men and women who flew these missions understood the risks. They knew Soviet interceptors tracked them on radar, that surface-to-air missile batteries locked onto their aircraft, that the margin between routine operation and disaster was sometimes measured in minutes or miles. Yet they continued to fly, motivated by a sense of duty and belief in the importance of their mission. Behind every intercept sat a human being, tired, cold, utterly focused on preventing the war everyone feared. Hendrickx was one of these experts. He had joined the Air Force straight out of high school in Pennsylvania, drawn by the promise of education and adventure. His aptitude tests revealed an exceptional ability to recognize patterns, and he was selected for training as an electronic warfare specialist. The training was grueling months of classroom instruction, followed by more months of practical exercises. All conducted in classified facilities he could not describe even to his family. But he thrived in this environment, discovering a talent for the patient, methodical work of signals intelligence. His first operational deployment had been to Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, where RC-135 aircraft monitored Soviet military activity in the Pacific. He flew missions over the Sea of Japan, listening to communications of Soviet naval vessels and air defense units. The work was tedious and often frustrating, hours of monotony, punctuated by brief moments of excitement when a significant signal appeared. But Hendrickx found satisfaction in contributing to the larger intelligence picture, knowing the fragments he collected were being combined with information from other sources to provide decision-makers with the knowledge they needed. The transfer to Mildenhall had been a promotion of sorts, an acknowledgement of his developing expertise. The European theater was considered more significant than the Pacific. With heavier concentration of Soviet forces and a more complex electromagnetic environment, Missions were longer and more demanding, targets more sophisticated. Hendrickx rose to the challenge, earning the respect of colleagues and the confidence of commanders. The detection of the Typhoon transmission, though brief, was exactly the kind of fine intelligence analysts prayed for. Information from Hendrickx's detection was transmitted to the National Security Agency for detailed analysis. Cryptographers worked to extract meaning from encrypted content, while traffic analysts examined characteristics of the transmission itself. Frequency, duration, modulation, pattern all provided clues about the type of equipment used and potentially the identity of the transmitting vessel. Previous intercepts had established baseline signatures for different classes of Soviet submarines. Analysts compared the new data against these baselines to confirm the initial assessment. The process of signals intelligence analysis was slow and painstaking, requiring integration of information from multiple sources over extended periods. A single transmission like the one Hendrickx detected might seem insignificant in isolation, but combined with earlier intercepts, satellite imagery, and reports from other collection platforms, it could confirm patterns that had been suspected but not proven. The analysis began immediately upon the RC-135's return to Mildenhall. The recorded data was downloaded and transmitted via secure channels to NSA headquarters at Fort Meade. Their teams of specialists went to work. Cryptanalysts attempted to break the encryption, though they knew this was likely futile. Soviet naval codes were among the world's most secure. Traffic analysts examined the technical characteristics of the transmission, its frequency, bandwidth, modulation scheme, signal strength. These parameters were compared against a massive database of previous intercepts, looking for matches that might identify the specific submarine and even the individual communications equipment used. Geolocation specialists worked to refine the submarine's position. The initial bearing from the RC-135 provided a starting point, but true accuracy required triangulation from multiple sensors. They consulted with the P-3 Orion crew that had been dispatched to the area, comparing acoustic data from sonobuoy drops with the electronic intelligence. They examined satellite imagery of the search area, looking for any surface indications, periscope sightings, unusual water patterns, anything that might narrow down the submarine's location. Over time, these confirmations accumulated into comprehensive understanding of Soviet submarine operations that would have been impossible to achieve through any other means. Analysts built detailed profiles of individual submarines, tracking them through multiple patrol cycles, learning their commanders' habits and preferences, identifying maintenance periods and refit schedules. This knowledge became the foundation for American anti-submarine warfare strategy, informing everything from the deployment of attack submarines to the positioning of acoustic sensor arrays on the ocean floor. The value of this understanding became apparent during crises when decision-makers needed accurate and timely information about Soviet military activities. During tensions that followed the Cal 007 shootdown, intelligence from RC-135 missions provided crucial reassurance that the Soviet military was not preparing for war. Analysts could see that Soviet submarine deployments remained within normal parameters, that communications traffic showed no signs of unusual alert activity, and that the incident, however tragic, was not the prelude to larger conflict. This information helped calm nerves in Washington and prevent the crisis from escalating further. The Cold War was, in many ways, one with information rather than bullets. Both sides understood that knowledge of the enemy's capabilities and intentions was essential to avoiding catastrophe. The elaborate intelligence networks each superpower constructed satellites, submarines, reconnaissance aircraft existed not primarily to prepare for war but to prevent it. By reducing uncertainty about each other's forces, they reduced the risk of miscalculation that could trigger conflict. This principle had been proven during several close calls. During the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, intelligence from U-2 reconnaissance aircraft had revealed Soviet missile deployments in Cuba, allowing President Kennedy to respond with a measured quarantine rather than an immediate invasion that might have sparked nuclear war. During the 1973 Yom Kippur War, intelligence about Soviet military movements had helped prevent direct superpower confrontation in the Middle East. During the 1983 Able Archer NATO exercise, Soviet intelligence indicating that the exercise was just that TAN exercise, not preparation for actual attack, had helped prevent a potentially catastrophic Soviet overreaction. The reconnaissance missions conducted by platforms like the RC-135 were part of this broader system of strategic stability. They were not acts of aggression, but acts of reassurance, providing the information that allowed both sides to avoid worst-case assumptions about each other's intentions. When American analysts could track Soviet submarine deployments and verify they remained within normal parameters, American leaders could respond to crises with confidence rather than panic. When Soviet intelligence could monitor American military exercises and verify they were defensive in nature, Soviet leaders could avoid the hair-trigger responses that might lead to accidental war. This is not to suggest the intelligence competition was without dangers. Reconnaissance missions themselves created risks, as the Cal 007 incident tragically demonstrated. Soviet efforts to counter American surveillance sometimes led to aggressive actions that could have triggered confrontations. The information gathered by both sides was not always interpreted correctly, leading to miscalculations that occasionally brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. The Soviet Navy's reaction to American surveillance capabilities evolved throughout the Cold War. Early in the competition, Soviet commanders were often unaware of the extent to which their communications were being monitored. As evidence of American capabilities accumulated, however, the Soviets implemented increasingly sophisticated countermeasures. Communication security became a matter of intense focus, with rigorous procedures designed to minimize information that could be gleaned from intercepted transmissions. New encryption systems were developed and deployed, requiring American codebreakers to constantly adapt their techniques. Electronic warfare specialists aboard Soviet submarines received extensive training in recognizing and evading American surveillance. They learned to identify characteristic signatures of RC-135 aircraft and other collection platforms, adjusting behavior when these platforms were detected in the area. The submarines carried their own sophisticated electronic warfare suites receivers that could detect the electromagnetic emissions of American surveillance radars, direction-finding equipment that could locate reconnaissance aircraft, and jammers that could, in theory, disrupt American sensor systems. Communications were scheduled for times when surveillance coverage was expected to be minimal, during storms when aircraft would be grounded, during shift changes when operator fatigue might reduce alertness, during periods when American intelligence analysts had learned the Soviets preferred to communicate. Burst transmission techniques compressed messages into fractions of a second, reducing the window for interception. The transmission Petrov had made was typical 3 seconds of compressed, encrypted data that contained a routine status report, a position update, and confirmation of patrol orders. In those 3 seconds, the submarine transmitted what would have taken several minutes in conventional communications. Deception operations were conducted to feed false information to American analysts, attempting to corrupt the intelligence picture they were constructing. Submarines would occasionally make transmissions from positions they were about to leave, creating the impression they were still in that location when they had actually moved elsewhere. False traffic was generated to suggest patrol patterns that did not match actual operations. Decoy transmitters were deployed on surface vessels to create the impression of submarine activity where none existed. The Soviets even experimented with underwater communication systems that used blue-green lasers, a technology that, while promising, never achieved operational reliability during the Cold War. Petrov was well-versed in these techniques. His training had included extensive instruction in communication security, and he had participated in exercises designed to test the effectiveness of Soviet countermeasures. He understood that American aircraft constantly prowled the periphery of Soviet operations, listening for any electronic emission that might reveal the location and activities of his submarine. This awareness shaped every decision he made, every communication he authorized, every movement of his vessel through the depths. The awareness of American surveillance capabilities created constant tension aboard Soviet submarines. Every transmission carried risk. Every electronic emission was a potential vulnerability. Commanders had to balance the need to communicate with headquarters against the danger of revealing their positions. This tension was exhausting, a persistent strain on already stressed crews operating in an inherently demanding environment. The reality was that both sides continually adjusted techniques in response to perceived capabilities of the other. This dynamic, sometimes called the intelligence cycle, drove constant innovation. When American codebreakers achieved a breakthrough, Soviet cryptographers developed new systems to restore security. When Soviet submarines adopted new quieting technologies, American analysts developed new detection methods. The competition was never-ending, each advantage temporary, each breakthrough eventually countered by the other side's ingenuity. The financial cost of this competition was staggering. The United States invested billions of dollars in reconnaissance aircraft, satellites, ground-based listening posts, and the analytical infrastructure that processed collected information. The Soviet Union spent comparable sums on its submarine fleet and countermeasures designed to protect it. These expenditures represented resources that could have been devoted to other purposes of dead weight loss to both economies that continued throughout 4 decades of the Cold War. Yet the expenditure was considered essential by decision-makers on both sides. The alternative to an expensive intelligence competition was an even more expensive arms race conducted in darkness, with each side building ever larger arsenals because they could not accurately assess the other's capabilities. Intelligence collected by platforms like the RC-135 provided the understanding that made arms control possible, allowing negotiators to craft agreements that reduced nuclear arsenals while maintaining strategic stability. In this sense, the investment in intelligence was not waste, but a contribution to security that ultimately saved lives and resources. The human cost of the intelligence war was harder to calculate, but no less real. Crews of reconnaissance aircraft faced constant stress. Knowing their missions brought them into proximity with hostile forces that might respond with lethal force. Analysts who processed collected intelligence worked long hours in windowless facilities, grappling with ambiguous data that might determine the fate of nations. Submarine crews on both sides endured months of isolation and tension, bearing the weight of nuclear weapons they hoped would never be used. Some paid the ultimate price. American reconnaissance aircraft were lost in accidents and hostile actions throughout the Cold War, their crews killed or captured. Soviet submariners died in reactor accidents, torpedo explosions, and other mishaps the Soviet government tried to conceal. The Cold War was nominally at peace, but it claimed lives as surely as any hot conflict. As the 1980s progressed, the intelligence picture of Soviet submarine operations became increasingly comprehensive. American analysts could track movements of individual submarines from the moment they left port until they returned. Correlating electronic intercepts with acoustic detections and satellite imagery, they understood Soviet patrol patterns, command procedures, operational readiness, in unprecedented detail. This knowledge provided American naval commanders with confidence to develop strategies that could counter the Soviet submarine threat in the event of war, while minimizing the risk of miscalculation that could trigger conflict. The Soviets were aware their submarine fleet was being observed with increasing precision, and this awareness contributed to a growing sense of strategic vulnerability. Throughout the Cold War, Soviet military planners had counted on submarine-launched missiles as the ultimate guarantee of national survival, the force that would ensure devastating retaliation, even if the Americans achieved surprise with a first strike. As American surveillance capabilities improved, this guarantee seemed less certain. If American attack submarines could track Soviet boomers, they could potentially sink them before they could launch their missiles, negating Soviet second strike capability. This concern drove Soviet investments in improved submarine technology and countermeasures. It also contributed to an increasingly aggressive Soviet posture in other areas, as military planners sought to offset perceived American advantages in submarine warfare. The competition spiraled, each improvement on one side generating a response from the other, neither able to achieve decisive advantage. The result was a strategic equilibrium maintained at ever higher levels of investment and risk. The equilibrium finally broke not through military developments, but through political and economic changes within the Soviet Union. The costs of competing with the United States across the full spectrum of military capabilities, including submarines and the surveillance platforms designed to counter them, contributed to the economic exhaustion that ultimately doomed the Soviet system. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he recognized the Soviet Union could not sustain its military competition with the West indefinitely. The reforms he initiated, intended to revitalize the Soviet system, ultimately led to its dissolution. The end of the Cold War transformed the mission of the RC-135 fleet. The aircraft continued to operate, their sophisticated sensors now directed at a wider range of targets in a more complex global environment. Skills developed in tracking Soviet submarines proved applicable to other intelligence challenges, from monitoring regional conflicts to countering terrorism. Crews who had spent careers listening to Soviet communications adapted to new targets and new technologies, their expertise remaining valuable even as the strategic context changed entirely. For Petrov, the end of the Cold War brought disillusionment and uncertainty. The Navy he had served with such dedication was rapidly declining, submarines rusting in port for lack of maintenance funds, crews unpaid and demoralized. The strategic mission that had given meaning to his career seemed suddenly irrelevant. The enemy he had prepared to fight had transformed into an uncertain partner in a new world order. Like many Soviet military officers, he struggled to find purpose in the post-Cold War world, his skills and experience suddenly obsolete. The Typhoon-class submarines that Petrov commanded have largely been retired, their enormous hulls either scrapped or converted to other purposes. The one that Hendrickx briefly detected on that March night in 1983 completed its patrol and returned safely to Murmansk, its crew unaware of how close they had come to detection. The intelligence from that mission was filed away with thousands of other reports, one small contribution to the vast archive of Cold War secrets. Historians are only now beginning to explore. Years later, at a naval history conference in London, Petrov found himself sharing a table with a retired American submariner. They were both older now, gray-haired and cautious. The American had commanded an attack submarine that spent the 1980s hunting Soviet boomers in the North Atlantic. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Former enemies united by experiences few others could understand. "We never wanted to use them," Petrov said finally, speaking in careful English. "The missiles. I prayed every day we would not receive the order." The American nodded slowly. "We prayed you wouldn't either. That's why we tracked you. How to start a war. To prevent one." "I understand that now," Petrov replied. "Then, I thought you were the enemy. Now I realize we were all just men trying to survive." They raised their glasses in a silent toast. To peace, to survival, to the war that never came. Hendrickx completed his Air Force career and transitioned to civilian life. Using his technical skills in the aerospace industry, he rarely discussed his service, bound by secrecy agreements that remained in force despite the Cold War's end. But he remembered the missions over the North Atlantic, the hours of patient listening. It's a brief moment of excitement when his screen revealed the presence of a Soviet submarine far below. It was a small contribution to a vast effort, but it was his contribution, and he carried it with quiet pride. Today, the remaining RC-135s continue to fly, their missions classified, but their importance undiminished. New generations of electronic warfare specialists monitor new threats: Chinese submarines in the South China Sea, Russian vessels testing NATO boundaries, Iranian naval forces in the Persian Gulf. The aircraft themselves have been repeatedly modernized, their Cold War-era equipment replaced with systems that would have seemed miraculous to operators like Hendrickx. Digital signal processors have replaced analog equipment. Satellite communications enable real-time data sharing, and artificial intelligence assists in sorting through the massive volumes of intercepted communications. But the fundamental mission remains the same: to listen, to analyze, to provide the information that keeps the nation safe. The crew complement is still around 30 specialists, though their skills have evolved to match modern threats. They monitor not just traditional radio communications, but also cellular networks, satellite transmissions, data links, and even the inadvertent electromagnetic emissions from poorly shielded electronics. The electromagnetic spectrum has become far more crowded since the Cold War, with commercial communications, GPS signals, and countless other transmissions competing for the same frequencies once dominated by military systems. The threat environment has also evolved. Once the primary concern was Soviet ballistic missile submarines. Today's RC-135 crews track a diverse array of targets. Chinese Type 09 for submarines carry ballistic missiles and operate with increasing range and sophistication. Russian attack submarines, though fewer in number than their Soviet predecessors, are quieter and more capable. Regional powers like North Korea and potentially Iran have developed submarine capabilities that, while not matching those of major powers, still pose significant threats. The legacy of the Cold War intelligence competition extends beyond platforms and people who operated them. Techniques developed to track Soviet submarines now help monitor proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, combat international terrorism, maintain awareness of potential threats in an increasingly complex world. The institutions created to process and analyze signals intelligence continue to perform functions essential to national security. The lessons learned about the importance of intelligence to crisis management and arms control remain relevant to policymakers grappling with new challenges. The submarines that now patrol the world's oceans are quieter and more capable than their Cold War predecessors. Their crews trained to evade detection in an environment where surveillance technology has advanced, along with submarine design. The contest between hunter and hunted continues, though adversaries have changed and stakes have evolved. The techniques developed to track Soviet submarines now help monitor undersea activities of potential threats around the world, a constant vigil that protects not just one nation but the stability of the international system. Petrov eventually retired from the Russian Navy, living out his remaining years in a small apartment in St. Petersburg. The sealed envelope with target coordinates was destroyed when his submarine was decommissioned, but he never forgot what it contained. Sometimes, walking along the Neva River, he would look up at the sky and wonder if American surveillance aircraft still prowled the electromagnetic spectrum, listening for submarines that no longer sailed. The thought brought him not anger, but a strange sense of nostalgia for a time when the world seemed simpler, when he knew his purpose, when the enemy was clear. The stories of those who served, who flew and sailed, watched and wait, deserve to be remembered. They remind us of what was at stake, what was risked, the courage and dedication required to maintain peace in a world armed for destruction. The signal that Hendrickx detected on that March night in 1983 was brief. A few seconds of electronic emission from a submarine deep beneath the waves. But it represented something larger, the continuous effort to understand and monitor a threat that could have ended civilization. The men who participated in that effort on both sides of the Iron Curtain were engaged in a struggle demanding the best of their skills and courage. They faced dangers and endured hardships few recognized, their contributions classified and sacrifices unacknowledged. Now, as the Cold War fades from living memory into history, their stories can finally be told. The reconnaissance missions that tracked Soviet submarines from the sky, the technological competition that drove both sides to ever greater innovation, the human drama of crews operating in isolated and dangerous environments, these are tales that deserve preservation. They remind us of the price of security, the importance of vigilance in a world where the capacity for destruction has never been greater. The skies above the North Atlantic are quieter now, the constant patrols of the Cold War replaced by more selective presence. But the RC-135s still fly, their crews still listen. And the work of protecting the nation through intelligence continues. Building on foundations laid during those tense years when two superpowers stood on the brink of mutual annihilation, Petrov and Hendrickx never met until that conference in London, never knew each other's names during the years they faced each other across the electromagnetic spectrum. They were adversaries in a conflict fought through patience and technology rather than violence. Warriors in a war that never became the Holocaust both feared. Their story is the story of the Cold War tense, dangerous, ultimately resolved without the catastrophe that seemed so likely for so long. As we conclude this account of how American aircraft learned to listen to Soviet submarines from the sky, we can appreciate the full scope of what was achieved. Intelligence gathered by the RC-135 fleet and its predecessors helped maintain strategic stability during the most dangerous period in human history. The men and women who conducted these missions, often at great personal risk, contributed to an outcome that seemed impossible, a Cold War that remained cold, a nuclear standoff that never became a nuclear exchange. This is their legacy, one that deserves to be remembered as decades pass and new generations come of age in a world they helped preserve. The submarines still patrolled the depths, the aircraft still prowled the skies, and the eternal vigilance that kept the peace continues in new forms against new threats. But the foundation was laid during those tense years of the Cold War by men like Petrov and Hendrickx, adversaries who eventually became something like friends, united by the shared knowledge that they had both helped prevent the unthinkable. The story of the RC-135 and Soviet submarines is now part of history, but its lessons remain vitally relevant. Intelligence is the foundation of security. Knowledge is the key to avoiding miscalculation. These truths, learned through decades of Cold War experience, continue to guide nations that once stood on the brink of destruction. and the men who learned these lessons, who flew the missions, manned the submarines, analyzed the data, deserve our gratitude and our memory. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most remarkable chapters of the Cold War, the story of how they listened to submarines. From the Sky is ultimately a story about human ingenuity, dedication, and the desperate hope for peace in a world armed for war. It is a story that ends not with a bang, but with the quiet continuation of vigilance, the ongoing effort to understand and counter threats that never entirely disappear. And it is a story that reminds us of what is at stake and what is required to maintain the peace we too often take for granted.